Frank Dolan punched the same clock for 30 years. Same brass card slot. Same tired click. And the week the company handed him a gold 30-year service pin at a floor luncheon, the certified letter was already in the mail. His pension was void. He set the pin on the workbench and kept working. He did not argue. Personnel Director Gerald Prine said it plain, across a desk. Calm as a man reading a weather report. Sentiment doesn't vest, Mr. Dolan, months do. You're 60 days short, and no clock runs backward. 60 men on the floor knew by lunch. The company offered him $4,200 to sign it all away. 30 days to decide. I didn't take the check. That night, the local steward pulled a contract off a shelf nobody had opened since 1961. He ran his thumb down one clause, and he got very quiet. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small thing. Subscribe so you don't lose the thread of what happens next. And tell me in the comments the town you're watching from. The town where your father or your grandfather worked. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me take you back. Frank Dolan hired on at Merrow Stamping in the spring of 1948. He was 30 years old. He had a young wife and a fresh mortgage and hands that already knew how to hold a wrench. The plant sat at the low end of Ravensfield, Ohio, down by the river, a long brick building that breathed steam in the cold. You could smell the cutting oil 2 streets away. To Frank, it smelled like work. It smelled like a paycheck. He started on the 400-ton press. That machine did not forgive. It came down slow and heavy, and it did not care whose hand was under it. In his second winter, it caught the cuff of his glove and took him to the knuckle before the flywheel slowed. 3 stitches short of his fingers. He wrapped the hand himself and finished the shift. Because a missed shift was money, and money was Ruth. That was the arithmetic of Frank's whole life. Everything measured back to Ruth. He worked the doubles when the orders piled up. Christmas Eve, more than once, with the plant dark except for his bay and the man on the overhead crane. He worked the graveyard when the day men wouldn't. When the union called a strike in the autumn of 1959, Frank walked the line in the sleet with the rest of them, coffee going cold in a thermos, and he did not cross. Not once. He believed in the thing they were building. A floor where a man's word held. A wage a family could stand on. He paid off the house on that paycheck. Every board of it. He and Ruth stood in the yard the day the mortgage burned, and she held his arm, and neither of them said much, because they weren't the kind to make speeches. He put a girl through 2 years of nursing school on that paycheck, before she married and moved to Dayton. He kept the furnace running, and the table full, and the taxes clear. All of it came out of that same brass clock, punched twice a day, 30 years running. And he trained the young ones. That was the part he was proudest of, though he'd never say the word proud out loud. He'd take a kid straight off the street, all thumbs and nerves, and he'd stand behind him at the press and teach him how to listen to the machine, how to feel the die seat right, how to keep his hand where his hand belonged. Dozens of them over the years. The last was a boy named Pete Ostrowski, 24, all elbows, a good heart under a loud mouth. Frank taught Pete the same way somebody had once taught Frank. Slow, patient. Keep your hand where it belongs, son. The floor will feed you your whole life if you respect it. Here is the thing you have to understand, or none of the rest of it will land the way it should. The pension was not a bonus. It was not a gold watch. It was not a nice extra at the end. Ruth's heart had started to give out 3 years back. The doctor in Columbus called it congestive, said the word slow, like it should soften the blow. She was on insulin too, twice a day, morning and night, the little glass bottle in the door of the icebox where she could reach it. Her medicine cost real money. Her cardiologist cost more. The pension, $317 a month at full 30 years was what covered her. Frank had done that math 100 times at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil. $317 was Ruth's insulin. It was Ruth's heart doctor. It was the difference between her being all right and her not being all right. That was what a pension meant to Frank Dolan, not comfort. Her life, in monthly installments, earned one shift at a time. He never once doubted he'd get it. Why would he? He'd earned it in plain daylight for 30 years, in front of everybody. Frank believed, the way honest men believe, that fairness came automatic to a man who did right, that if you kept your side, the other side kept theirs. It never occurred to him that a thing could be true on the floor and false on paper, that a man in an office could pick up a pen and make 30 years shorter than 30 years. He was going to learn that. It cost him. It came in the mail on a Tuesday, a certified letter, the kind you sign for, and Ruth signed for it at the door because Frank was still at the plant. She set it on the table against the sugar bowl, unopened, the way you leave a thing you can tell is heavy. He opened it after supper, in his reading glasses, under the kitchen light. Read it twice. Read it a third time. Then he set it down very carefully and smoothed it flat with the side of his hand, like a man will do when he doesn't trust his hands. The letter said his pension did not vest. It said his continuous service had been broken. It said that in the autumn of 1959 he had been laid off for a period of 6 weeks, and that under the plan's language a break of that length reset the clock on continuous service. It said, therefore, that Frank Dolan's 30 years were not 30 years, they were counted from his recall. Which left him, the letter put the number right there, plain, like it cost nothing to type, 60 days short of the 30-year threshold. 60 days short of $317 a month. 60 days short of Ruth. Nothing vested. Nothing at all. Ruth read it over his shoulder and put her hand flat on his back. She didn't say much. She wasn't the kind to. But her hand was shaking, and Frank felt it, and that was worse than any words. Now, Frank did the reasonable thing first. He always did the reasonable thing first. He got out a clean sheet of paper the next evening, and he wrote them a reply in his careful block print. He was not angry in the letter. He didn't know how to be angry on paper. He wrote that there must be a mistake. He wrote that the 1959 layoff had been 6 weeks at most, and that he had been recalled and returned to his same machine, and that surely under the contract a recall that quick preserved a man's service. He asked them, plainly, to please check the recall clause. He signed it, folded it, mailed it certified himself, so there'd be a record. He was proud of that letter, in his quiet way. It was fair. It gave them the benefit of the doubt. It assumed a mistake, because Frank could not yet imagine it was anything but a mistake. They never answered it. Not a word. It went into the silence like a stone into a pond, and the pond closed over it and was smooth again. That was warning number 1, though Frank didn't know to call it that yet. He'd asked them, in writing, to check the clause. They didn't check the clause. They chose not to. The Saturday after, he took it to the Union Hall. The hall was one big room over a hardware store, a coffee urn in the corner, a bulletin board thick with layered notices going yellow at the edges. Sal Marchetti met him there. Sal was the local's business agent, 47, built like a fire plug, a man who talked fast and read slow and careful. Which is the right way around. He read Frank's letter twice. Then he read the void notice from the company. Then he sat back and rubbed his jaw with a sound like sandpaper. 6 weeks, Sal said. You're sure it was 6 weeks in 59? 6 weeks. Maybe a hair less. They called me back before Thanksgiving. I remember, because Ruth had the turkey already. Sal nodded slow. He got up and went to a shelf along the back wall, the kind of shelf nobody looks at, crammed with binders gone gray. He pulled down a thick contract, the old master agreement, and he held it a second like he was weighing it. Nobody's carried a pension grievance all the way to binding arbitration since '61, Sal said, half to himself, thumbing the pages. Costs the local a year and a fortune. You go the distance on one of these, you'd better be right, and you'd better be able to prove it. He said it the way a man says something he doesn't expect to need. Thrown away, almost, he was already flipping past it, looking for the service language, and neither of them marked the words as they went by. Remember that. He said it, and it fell on the floor, and nobody picked it up. Sal found the clause. He read it under his breath, lips moving. And something crossed his face. Quick. There and gone. Let me hold on to these a few days, he said. Let me look at the old records. Don't do anything. Don't sign anything. You hear me, Frank? Whatever they put in front of you, you don't sign it. Frank heard him. But Frank still thought it was a mistake. That was the trouble. You can't fight hard against a thing you think is an accident. The letter to come to his machine 3 days later. A yellow slip in his time slot. Report to personnel, end of shift. Prine's office was up a set of iron stairs, above the noise, where the floor was carpet and the windows were clean. Gerald Prine sat behind a wide desk with nothing on it but a folder and a fountain pen laid square to the edge. He was a neat man, Prine, neat hair, neat cuffs, a small mouth that held itself like it was doing you a favor by opening. He had Frank's file in front of him. He'd read it. He'd more than read it. He asked Frank to sit. Frank sat, cap in his hands, oil still under his nails from the shift. I've reviewed your correspondence, Prine said. He tapped the folder with one finger. I understand this is difficult, but the plan language isn't a matter of opinion. A break in continuous service resets the vesting clock. Yours was reset in 1959. I'm sure you feel that 30 years is 30 years. He gave a small, practiced smile. Sentiment doesn't vest, Mr. Dolan, months do. You're 60 days short, and no clock runs backward. Frank turned his cap in his hands. I wrote and asked you to check the recall clause. I checked everything I'm required to check. I was called back inside 6 weeks. That's not a break, the way I understand it. There's a provision. Mr. Dolan, Prine folded his hands. I'm not going to debate contract language with you across this desk. That's not what this meeting is for. He slid a single sheet across the polished wood and turned it so it faced Frank and set the fountain pen on top of it like a man laying down a card. The company would like to be fair to you. In recognition of your years of service, we're prepared to offer you a lump sum. $4,200. You sign a release, you take the check, and this is closed, clean, for everybody. It's a generous number, given that nothing is owed. $4,200. Frank looked at it. It was more cash than he'd ever held at once, and it was a little over a year of Ruth's medicine if you were careful, and then it was gone, and then there was nothing behind it for the years after that. How long do I have? Frank said. 30 days. The offer expires. After that we're simply back to the plan language, which owes you nothing. Prine capped and uncapped the pen, a small idle sound. I'd take the certainty, in your position. A grievance is a long road, Mr. Dolan, long and expensive, and it very rarely goes where a man hopes. You could spend a year fighting for something you were never entitled to, and come out the far end with nothing but the fight. The small smile again. $4,200 is a bird in the hand. Frank stood up. He did not take the pen. I'll think on it, he said. And he put his cap on his head, and he went back down the iron stairs to the noise, where things were still true. He told Sal that night. Sal went very still on the phone, then swore once, quietly. They're rushing you, he said. 30 days. That's not fairness, that's a stampede. Don't you sign that thing. And the next morning Sal did what a careful man does. He put it in writing. He sent the company a formal letter. Frank saw the carbon, stating that the local had reason to believe Frank Dolan's service record had been altered, that the 1959 layoff was being misrepresented, and that the union was reserving all rights pending review of the original records. He mailed it certified. He kept the green card. That was warning number 2. In writing. On the record, the union told them, plainly, that the file was wrong and asked them to look. They didn't answer that one either. Now here is where the company made its mistake. Not a mistake of paper, a mistake of nerve. Frank's 30-year anniversary fell on the second Friday of the month, and Merrow Stamping had a custom, going back to the old man's day, of marking a 30-year man in front of the floor. A luncheon, right there in the bay, tables set up between the presses, the machines idled for 1 hour, sandwiches, and a sheet cake, and a little speech. It was the 1 hour a year the plant felt like a family instead of a ledger. Nobody thought to cancel it. Or maybe somebody decided, up in the clean offices, that canceling it would look worse than going through with it. Either way, on the second Friday of the month, they threw Frank Dolan his 30-year luncheon. The same week the void letter sat on his kitchen table, and every man on that floor knew it. The word had gone around the way word goes around a plant, machine to machine, at the water fountain in the parking lot. By that Friday, all 60 of them knew that the company was about to hand Frank a gold pin for 30 years with one hand, while it was taking the 30 years away with the other. They set the tables up between the presses. They laid out the sandwiches. Howard Merrow came down for it, which he rarely did. Merrow was the second one to run the plant, the old man's son, a smooth, soft man in a good suit who'd inherited a floor he'd never worked a day of. He treated the men like line items, because to him that's what they were. He came down the iron stairs, smiling that inherited smile, and he stood at the head of the tables, and he made the speech. He said Frank Dolan was the kind of man that built this company. He said 30 years was a rare and beautiful thing in this day and age. He said loyalty like Frank's deserved to be honored. He said all of it smiling, holding the little velvet box, and not one man in that bay made a sound. You have to see it the way it was. 60 machinists, in their work clothes, caps in their hands. Frank at the front in his oiled dark apron. The presses cooling and ticking around them. And the men, they knew. Every one of them knew the letter had come. They stood there with their jaws set and their eyes down, and the silence coming off them was the loudest thing in that building. It was not the silence of men enjoying a party. It was the silence of 60 men watching a robbery in good light and not yet knowing what a man could do about it. Merrow finished. He opened the velvet box. Inside was the pin, gold, small, 30 stamped on it. The years a man gives a place turned into a thing you could lose in a coat pocket. He took Frank's hand, that broad hand with the oil worked into the creases and the old white scar across the knuckle, and he pressed the pin into it, and he shook it, and he smiled for whatever eyes were watching. Frank looked at the pin in his palm. And here is the part I want you to hold on to, because it's the whole man in one moment. He did not shout. He did not throw it. He did not say a word about the letter. Not there. Not in front of the boy Pete, who was watching him with his fists balled up. Not in front of Merrow's soft, smiling face. Frank Dolan looked at the gold pin in his oil-dark hand, and he closed his fingers around it, and he said, "Thank you. It's been a good place to work." Even, steady, like he meant the thanks, and only the thanks. Then he put the pin in the bib pocket of his apron. He nodded to the men. And he turned around and walked back to his machine, and he keyed it on, and the noise came up and swallowed the quiet, and Frank Dolan went back to work. Some of the men said later that was the moment they decided. Not when the letter came. When Frank thanked them and walked back to his press with the pin in his pocket and his back straight. A man that steady, being robbed that plain, it did something to the floor. Pete Ostrowski told me he stood there shaking, and he didn't even know yet what he was going to do, only that he was going to do something. That night the bills were on the kitchen table. Ruth had them out when Frank got home. She hadn't meant to. She'd been trying to work the month's arithmetic, and the papers had just spread themselves out under the light. The cardiologist's statement, the pharmacy account, the insulin. The little column of numbers that only balanced if the $317 was there behind it. She looked up when he came in, and she started to gather them, embarrassed, and Frank said, "Leave them, Ruthie, let me see where we are." He sat down and put on his glasses and went through them slow. And the $4,200 sat in his mind the whole time. Because $4,200 would clear that table tonight. It would clear it clean. It would buy a year of quiet, maybe a little more. He could sign the release Prine had slid across the desk, and the shaking in Ruth's hand at the door would stop. Ruth watched his face. She knew him better than the contract did. "Frank," she said, "gentle, take the check. Take it, and let's be done. You're 60 years old. You've given them everything you had. Take the money, and let's just rest." Her voice caught on the word. She wasn't afraid for herself, or she'd never have said she was. She was afraid of a year of fighting, of watching him worn down by men in clean offices, of the cost of hope. Take the check. Rest. It was love talking. It was the most reasonable thing anybody said in this whole story. And Frank almost did. I'll tell you that plain. He sat at that table with the bills fanned out and Ruth's tired eyes on him, and $4,200 one signature away, and part of him wanted to take it and be done and never climb those iron stairs again. Then Sal Marchetti called. Sal had spent 3 nights with the old contract and a stack of the company's own records, the ones the union was entitled to see. And he'd found it. He asked Frank to come down to the hall Sunday morning, and there was something in his voice, tight and careful, that made Frank say yes before he'd thought about it. Sunday the hall was empty and cold. Sal had the contract open on the long table, and next to it he had Frank's original service card, the real one, the one from personnel's own files. He put his blunt finger on the contract first. "Continuous service," Sal read. Here's the language. "A man's service is continuous unless it's broken by a layoff longer than the recall period. That's what they're hanging you on. 6 weeks in 59, they say. That's a break. That resets you." He moved his finger down the page, slow, to a paragraph in smaller type, the kind of paragraph nobody reads because nobody thinks they'll ever need it. But here. Right here. The recall provision. Read it with me. Frank leaned in over his glasses. "A recall to work within 90 days of layoff," Sal read, "shall be deemed to preserve unbroken continuous service, and no break shall be recorded." He looked up. 90 days, Frank. Not 6 weeks. 90 days. If they called you back inside 90 days of laying you off, then under this contract there was never any break at all. You're 30 years, stay 30 years. The clock never reset. It couldn't. Let me make sure you're standing where I'm standing, because this is the hinge the whole thing turns on. The company said a layoff broke Frank's service. But the men who wrote this contract, back before any of these office men were born, thought about exactly this. They wrote in a safety catch. If the company calls you back fast, inside 90 days, then the layoff doesn't count. Your years run straight through. On paper, the break never happened. That's the clause. That's the whole fight, right there in the small type nobody opened since 1961. "So the question is simple," Sal said. "How fast did they recall you in 59? If it's inside 90 days, they've got nothing. You're vested. You've been vested for years." "I told you," Frank said. 6 weeks. Before Thanksgiving. Sal put the service card down next to the contract. He tapped it. His voice went quiet. The same quiet Frank had heard on the phone that first night. Only worse now. That's just it, Frank. 6 weeks is well inside 90 days. So there should be no break on your record at all. None. He slid the card and inched toward the light. But look what your file says. Frank looked. The card said he'd been laid off in October of 1959. And then, in a different typeface, a little heavier on the keys, in the space where the recall should have been recorded, someone had typed something else. Not laid off and recalled. The card said Frank Dolan had voluntarily quit in October of 1959 and been hired back on as a new man 41 days later. Voluntary quit. New hire. You never quit, Sal said. It wasn't a question. I never quit a day in my life, Frank said. His voice had gone strange in his own ears. I was laid off. Everybody was, that fall. They called us back when the orders came in. I walked the strike line for that company, Sal. I never once quit. I know you didn't, Sal said. But somebody typed that you did. Somebody sat at a machine and typed voluntary quit into your record, so that when the recall clause could have saved you, there was no recall to point to. A quit isn't a layoff. A quit doesn't get the 90 days. A quit resets the clock clean, and nobody has to explain a thing. He let it sit. It's not that they missed the recall clause, Frank. It's that somebody made sure it couldn't apply. On paper. On purpose. The two men stood there in the cold, empty hall over that little card, and Frank Dolan felt something he had not felt in 30 years of that plant. Not the near miss of the press on his hand. Something colder and further down. The floor of his own life had a false board in it, and somebody had nailed it there 20 years ago, and left it, and forgotten it, sure that no one would ever pry it up. They forgot one thing. They forgot that quiet people read the fine print. Sal folded his arms. I have to tell you straight, because you deserve straight. If we take this, we take it all the way. Binding arbitration. A hearing, a neutral, the whole machine, and the company will fight it with lawyers you and I can't afford, and it could take a year. Maybe more. They'll bury us in paper. They'll try to run the local out of money. There's no promise at the end of it. I told you nobody's carried one of these to the wall since '61. That wasn't just talk. He met Frank's eyes. But I've got a contract that says you never broke service, and a company record that says somebody lied to make it look like you did. In 30 years, I've never had a cleaner wrong to carry. If you want to fight it, Frank, I'll spend the last dollar this local has, and I'll enjoy it. Frank thought about Ruth at the table. Take the check. Rest. He thought about the $4,200 that would clear the bills tonight and leave nothing behind it. He thought about $317 a month, every month, for the rest of Ruth's life, and how it was already his, had been his for years, sitting there earned and stolen at the same time. And he thought about a man at a typewriter 20 years back, calmly making 30 years into nothing. He reached into the bib pocket of his apron, which he still had on, and he took out the gold pin. He set it on the table next to the falsified card, the two of them side by side under the cold light. The honor and the lie, what they gave him with one hand and what they'd done with the other, right there together. 30 days, Frank said. That's what Prine gave me to sign his check. When's it up? End of the week. Frank picked the pin back up and put it away. Then we've got till the end of the week, he said. Get your papers ready, Sal, but nobody had signed anything yet. Prine's check was still on the desk, still waiting. The deadline was still coming. And a quiet man was about to have to decide, with his name and his hand, whether to take the sure money and rest, or put everything on one clause in a book nobody had opened in 17 years. Against a company that had already proven it would type a lie into a man's life and sleep fine. The pen was waiting on Prine's desk. And the week was almost up. The week was almost up, and Frank Dolan did not sleep much on the last 2 nights of it. He lay in the dark beside Ruth and listened to her breathe. It was not an easy breathing. It caught sometimes, the way a belt catches on a worn pulley, and then it found its rhythm again. He counted those catches the way a man counts a machine's cycles. He knew the sound of her heart the way he knew the 400-ton press. Both of them were things he'd spent a lifetime tending. Both of them were things that could stop. $4,200. It sat in his mind like the check sat on Prine's desk, patient, sure of itself. He could have it Friday. He could clear the medical statements that were fanned across the kitchen table under the sugar bowl. He could rest. Or he could put his name on a piece of paper that promised nothing except a year of waiting. On the last morning, Friday, the second Friday of the month, Frank got up before the alarm. He made coffee. He carried a cup to Ruth in bed and sat on the edge of the mattress while she took her insulin. Her hands shook a little at the plunger. 60 years old was too young for hands to shake like that, he thought. But diabetes did not read a birth certificate. "You went to see Sal," she said. It was not a question. "I did. And?" Frank looked at the window. The light was coming up gray over the Ostrowski roofline next door. They lied, Ruth, on paper. 20 years back somebody sat at a typewriter and made my layoff into a quit. To break the 30 years, to keep the pension. Ruth set the syringe down on the nightstand. She was quiet a while. "Take the check, Frank. Ruth, take the check." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the fear underneath it, running like current in a wire. $4,000 is real. It's in your hand. This other thing is a fight with a company that has lawyers on salary. You'd be 61 before it ended. 62. And they can just say no, and where are we then? Nothing. Not even the 4,000. He took her hand. Her fingers were cold. "You know what $317 a month is? It's a check. It's every month. For the rest of your life. It's the cardiologist and the insulin and this house, and never once wondering how. $4,000 is 6 months, maybe. Then it's gone. And I'm 60 years old, with no trade the plants still want, and we start eating the house." He pressed her cold hand between both of his oil-stained ones. "They earned me that pension by taking 30 years off my body. It's mine. It's already mine. I just have to make them give back what they stole." Ruth's eyes filled, but she did not let it spill. She was not a woman who let it spill. "And if you lose?" "Then I lose honest," Frank said, "and I'll have made them lie out loud, in front of people, to do it. That's worth something too." She didn't answer. She turned her hand over inside his and held on. That was her answer. Not yes. Not permission. Just her hand, holding on, while he did the thing she was afraid of. He drove to the Union Hall at 8. Sal Marchetti was already there, the coffee already burnt. The old master agreement open on the table where they'd left it, the falsified service card beside it, the gold pin's absence a shape Frank could still see. Sal had the grievance authorization typed up. 1 page. A few lines. A place at the bottom for a name. "Prine's deadline is today," Sal said. 5 o'clock, the letter said. "You sign his release, you take the 4,200, and it's over clean. You sign mine," he turned the page toward Frank, "and there's no 4,200, and no clean, and no promises. Just the machinery. I file this by 4, we're inside the deadline, and after that the company can't touch the buyout offer again without me at the table." He set a fountain pen down on the paper. Not Prine's pen. His own. "I'll tell you straight, Frank, nobody's carried a pension grievance to binding arbitration since 61. It costs. It drags. Half the time the man dies before the award. I'm not going to lie to you about the odds." Frank looked at the page. He thought about Ruth's hand holding on. He did not reach for his apron pocket this time. The pin stayed home. He picked up Sal's pen, and he read the lines, all of them, the way a quiet man reads the fine print, and then he signed his name at the bottom in the plain, square hand he'd used to sign for 30 years of parts and time cards, and one gold pin he never asked for. Frank Dolan. He set the pen down. "There," he said. "Now it's a fight." Sal looked at the signature a long moment. Something moved in his face, something he'd been holding down for years. "First one I've had this clean in 30 years on this job," he said. "Let's go steal it back." He filed it that afternoon, 10 minutes to 4, inside the deadline. And Prine's check sat on Prine's desk, unsigned, and would stay unsigned, and somewhere in the personnel office a man who believed nobody read far enough got a copy of a one-page grievance that said somebody finally had. Then came the waiting. Nobody tells you that a fight is mostly waiting. The letter and the luncheon and the desk and the pen, those were fast. What came after was slow, the way a season is slow, the way a wound is slow. Sal filed the demand for arbitration. The company answered. The company answered late. The company asked for extensions, and got them because the machinery grinds fine and grinds slow, and the man with the salaried lawyers can afford the grinding better than the man on a fixed pension. Sal subpoenaed the records. All of them. Frank's original service card, the personnel file, the time cards, the payroll ledgers going back to 1959. He wanted the paper. Paper was the only witness that couldn't be scared off the stand. The company buried him in it. "Look at this," Sal said one night in October, 3 months into the waiting. He had boxes on the Union Hall table now, cardboard boxes furred with dust. The flaps soft with age. "They sent me everything. And I mean everything. 9,000 pages, requisition orders, cafeteria receipts. 9,000 pages, and somewhere in it is the one page I need, and they know I've got to find it myself. Page by page. On my own time. On the local's dime." He rubbed his eyes. "This is how they win, Frank, not by being right. By being able to afford being wrong longer than you can afford being right." Frank pulled up a chair. "Then we read 9,000 pages." "You don't have to. I've got 2 hands and a chair." Frank took a box. "Ruth's asleep by 9. I'm no good to her staring at the ceiling. Give me a stack." So they read. 2 men under a bad light, 1 apron shouldered, and 1 shirt sleeved. Turning pages that smelled of mildew and old ink, looking for a lie in a haystack of the truth. Night after night. The time cards were there, thousands of them. Frank's own hand punching in and out across the years. The winters he'd worked doubles printed right there in faded purple ink. He found the week he'd nearly lost his fingers to the press, a gap, then a return. His hand shakier on the card for a month after. He found the strike he'd honored. His whole working life was in those boxes, reduced to punch marks and dates, and it was strange to hold it, the way it's strange to hear your own voice on a recording. But the 1959 file was thin. Too thin. "The layoff paperwork isn't here," Sal said, going through it a third time. "The recall paperwork isn't here. 6 weeks of your life in 1959, the 6 weeks that this whole thing turns on, and there's nothing. A voluntary quit form dated October. A new hire form dated 6 weeks later. No layoff notice. No recall notice. Like the recall clause never existed. Like the 90 days never mattered, because there was nothing to recall you from." He set the pages down. "They didn't just alter the card, Frank. They cleaned the file. Whoever did this took the layoff and the recall right out of the drawer." Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. "You can't fight what isn't there." "No," Sal said. You can't." And for the first time, the cold thing in his voice was doubt. That was the near stall. 3 weeks of it. The deadline for producing their own documents came and went, and the union had a beautiful clause and an ugly falsified card and no proof of the original truth. Sal filed a motion to compel. The company said the older records had been lost in the ordinary course. Lost, 41 days that a man's whole pension hung on, lost in the ordinary course. Frank came home one of those nights, and Ruth was awake at the kitchen table, the calendar in front of her, counting insulin against the days the way she did now. She looked up. She saw his face. "It's going bad," she said. "It's going slow." "Frank," she reached out and put her hand flat on the calendar, over the little penciled numbers, her ration of days. "How long?" He didn't have an answer. He sat down across from her, and he did not lie, because he had never lied to her, and he was not going to start over a company's lie. "I don't know," he said. "Sal thinks we might not have the proof." They cleaned the file. Ruth looked at him a long time. Then she did something he did not expect. She almost smiled. "Then they wrote it down somewhere," she said. "Men like that always write it down twice. They can't help it. It's how they cover. Find the man who kept the second copy." Frank looked at his wife. 30 years I typed for the county assessor before my heart," Ruth said. "You think a clerk doesn't know how a file gets cleaned? Somebody signed the time cards in 59. Somebody in the timekeeper's office. Find him." The timekeeper in 1959 had been a man named Walt Kubiak. Frank remembered him, a fussy, particular man with sleeve garters and a green visor who ran his little cage of a records office like a bank vault and complained if a card came in bent. He'd retired years back. Sal ran him down through the old pension rolls, still alive, 79 now. In a bungalow out past the fairgrounds with a daughter who checked on him. Frank went himself. Sunday afternoon. He brought a box of the pastries Ruth used to buy the man at Christmas, because Frank remembered that too, that Kubiak had a sweet tooth and a soft spot for anybody who remembered it. Walt Kubiak was smaller than Frank remembered, and slower, but the eyes behind the glasses were the same fussy, particular eyes. He remembered Frank. He remembered the press accident. He remembered, when Frank got to it, the winter of 1959. "Layoffs," Kubiak said, and his mouth pinched. 6 weeks. Whole department, near enough. Order slip from the front office. Then Merrow got a run of government contracts and called everybody back in the new year. Recall, I processed all of it. Layoff cards, recall cards, the whole business. He frowned. "Why?" "Because the company says it never happened," Frank said. "They say I quit. Voluntary, in 1959. And got hired new after. They say my file proves it." The old man went very still. Then a color came up in his face that Frank had not seen on many men that age. "Fury, that's a lie," Kubiak said. "That is an out-and-out lie. You were laid off and recalled inside 2 months, and I have." He stopped. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. "I have my carbons." Frank did not breathe. "I kept carbons," Kubiak said. 30 years. Every card that came through my cage, I kept a carbon, because I did not trust that office as far as I could throw it, and I was right not to. The front office lost things when it suited them. So I kept my own. They're in the cellar. In a footlocker. My daughter's been at me to burn them for a decade." His jaw set. "I never did." "You want to know why I never did, Mr. Dolan? Because I always figured, one day, one of you fellows was going to come to my door needing to prove the truth. And here you are." He made his daughter carry the footlocker up. And there they were, carbon copies, purple and faded but readable, dated and initialed. A layoff notice, Frank Dolan, October of 1959. A recall notice, Frank Dolan, 41 days later. Not 60 days, not 90. 41, inside the clause. clean inside it. The layoff and the recall that the company said had never happened. Kept for 19 years in a footlocker in a cellar by a fussy man in a green visor who did not trust an office to tell the truth about a working man's life. Frank sat in that little bungalow and held the carbon of his own layoff notice, and for the first time since the certified letter came, his hands were not steady. He'd held his calm at the desk. He'd held it at the luncheon with 60 men watching. He held it now too, mostly, but his eyes stung, and he let them, because Walt Kubiak's eyes were stinging too. "Thank you," Frank said. "It came out rough." "Don't thank me," Kubiak said. "Go make them read it out loud." That was the relief. That was the end of the stall. Sal had his proof, the falsified card on one side, the true carbon on the other. The same 41 days told two different ways by two different men, one of them lying and one of them keeping faith in a cellar for 19 years. But the company was not finished. Because a cornered institution does not fight fair, it fights procedural. Their lawyer, a smooth young man named Dolan, up from a firm in the city, who had never punched a clock in his life, filed a motion to dismiss the whole grievance. Not on the merits, on timeliness. He argued that the void was a 1959 matter, that the clock on any grievance had run out decades ago, that the union's complaint was 19 years too late and could not be heard at all. "He's saying we waited too long to complain about a lie we only found this year," Sal said. He was gray in the face when he told Frank. "He's saying you should have grieved the falsification in 1959, the falsification you didn't know about, that they hid from you, that only surfaced when they voided your pension this summer. It's obscene. And it might work. Arbitrators throw cases on timeliness all the time. It's the clean way out. Nobody has to decide who's right, they just decide it's too late to ask." There was a hearing on the motion, not the big one, a small one, procedural, in a rented room with the arbitrator and the two lawyers and Frank in the back. The arbitrator was a woman named Helena Marsh, gray-haired, spare, with a face that gave away nothing. She listened to Dolan argue the clock had run. She listened to Sal argue you cannot start a clock on a fraud from the day the fraud was committed. If the fraud was hidden, you start it the day the man could have known. And the man could not have known until they told him, this summer, that his 30 years were 60 days short. Helena Marsh listened to both. Then she said, in a dry, even voice, "I'll reserve ruling on the motion. I'll hear the case on the merits and rule on timeliness and substance together. If the union's factual claim is what it represents, timeliness may look different in that light." She gathered her papers. "We'll convene in 3 weeks. Reserve ruling. Not a win, not a loss. 3 more weeks of the wire humming." That was the all is lost, if there was one, though Frank did not think of it in those words. He thought of it as the night Ruth's breathing caught more than usual, and he sat up till 3 counting the catches. He thought of it as the calendar, with the penciled numbers getting shorter. He thought of it as a smooth young man in the city, who had never made a thing with his hands, arguing that a working man had waited too long to object to a lie nobody let him see. But Marsh had said she'd hear it, and Frank had Kubiak's carbons. And he had 30 years of time cards in his own hand, and there was one more thing he had that the office didn't know about. Because the floor knew. The floor had always known. Pete Ostrowski, 24 now, the last apprentice Frank had trained, a quick-faced kid with a young family and a machinist's future Frank had helped build, Pete worked days in the shadow of the personnel office. And Pete heard things. Pete heard Prine, one afternoon by the water fountain, tell Dolan the lawyer, easy and low, that the old man'll settle before the hearing. They always do. And if he doesn't, the timeliness argument buries him, and either way it never touches the file. Never touches the file. Pete carried that to Frank in the parking lot at shift change, quiet, cap in his hand. "There's more, Frank," Pete said. "I don't know if it means anything. But when the subpoena came in, I saw Prine pull 3 files, not one. Yours and 2 others. He took them into his office and shut the door. I only ever heard the one name besides yours, Kaczmarek, from the tool room, retired in '72. But it was 3 files. Frank, 3, Frank told Sal. Sal went still in that particular way he had, the way a man goes still when a small wrong he's carrying suddenly turns out to be part of a larger one. 3 files, he said. Frank, if Prine did to 2 other men what he did to you, he didn't finish. He got a new subpoena. He named Kaczmarek. He named, on a hunch and a pension roll, one more man laid off in that same 1959 stretch. And when the files came, thin and cleaned like Frank's, they told the same story in the same hand. Voluntary quit, new hire, the layoff and the recall gone. The continuous service broken on paper. 3 men. The same lie 3 times, in the same initials at the corner of each altered card. G. P. Gerald Prine had not made one man's 30 years into nothing. He'd made a practice of it. He'd been quietly clipping the pensions of laid-off men for years, one cleaned file at a time, and pocketing the saved liability for the company like a clerk skimming a till. Except the till was other men's lives. "This is the whole case now," Sal said, and his hands were not quite steady either. "This isn't a mistake we're proving. It's a pattern. And a pattern isn't an error, Frank. A pattern is intent." They walked into the hearing room on a cold morning 3 weeks later with the truth in a folder and the men of the floor at their backs. The room was nothing to look at. A rented hall with folding chairs and a stenographer at a little table and a water pitcher going warm. Helena Marsh sat at the front behind a plain table. Doran sat at one side with 2 associates and a briefcase that cost more than Frank's car. Prine sat beside him, calm, his hands folded, the same calm he'd worn across the desk when he said months don't run backward. Behind Prine, arrived late and leaving early, Howard Merrow himself, the second-generation owner. Sat for exactly 20 minutes with the expression of a man forced to attend a function beneath him, the owner who was certain a floor machinist could not reach him, come to watch the machinist be turned away. And in the back, filling the folding chairs and standing along the wall, on their day off, in their good shirts, were the men of the floor. Not a handful. Dozens, 60, near enough. The same 60 who'd stood with their caps in their hands at the luncheon and watched the pin pressed into Frank's oiled dark palm. Pete was there. And near the front, small in a good suit that no longer fit, with sleeve garters visible at his wrists and a green visor nowhere in sight, but present in spirit, sat Walt Kubiak, 79 years old, who had kept his carbons for 19 years for exactly this morning. Sal laid it out plain. He put the falsified card in front of Marsh. Then he put Kubiak's carbon beside it. Same man. Same 41 days. 2 different stories. He called Walt Kubiak, who told in his fussy, precise voice how he had processed Frank's layoff and recall himself, how he had kept carbons because he did not trust the front office, how the front office record was false and his was true. Doran tried to shake him. You couldn't shake Walt Kubiak. He'd been shaken by better men than a city lawyer, and he'd kept his carbons through all of it. Then Sal put the other 2 files on the table. Kaczmarek and the 3rd man. The same alteration, the same initials in the corner. G.P. 3 men, Sal said to Helena Marsh, and his voice was quiet and it filled the room. 3 men laid off in the same weeks of 1959. 3 men recalled inside 90 days. 3 files altered, in the same hand, to erase the recall and break the service and void the pension. This is not a clerical error, and it is not too late to say so. It was hidden until this summer. My member could not grieve a fraud he was not permitted to see. He grieved it the week he found it. That's timely. And what it exposes, he set his hand flat on the 3 files, is worth this hearing's while. Marsh took 2 weeks to write it. Then she called them back to the same rented hall to read it aloud. Frank sat in the front row with Ruth beside him. She had insisted on coming. She sat in her good coat with her hands folded over her pocketbook and her breath catching now and then. And Frank held her hand, and behind them the men filled the room again. Helena Marsh put on her glasses. She read in that dry, even voice, and the room did not make a sound. She read the facts. 30 years. The pension of $317 a month. The 1959 layoff and the recall, 41 days apart, well inside the 90-day window. She read the continuous service clause and the recall provision word for word, the clause off the shelf nobody had opened since 1961, and in her reading it, stopped being fine print and became what it had always been. A promise, made in ink, that a man called back within 90 days never lost a day of his service. Then she read the finding. The employer contends the grievant broke his continuous service by a voluntary quit in 1959, Marsh read. The record does not support that contention. The record refutes it. The grievant's own service card was altered to reflect a voluntary quit and rehire. The contemporaneous carbon copies of the layoff and recall notices, kept by the timekeeper of record, establish that the grievant was laid off and recalled within 41 days, within the recall provision, and that his continuous service was, at all relevant times, unbroken. She turned a page. This is not a technicality. The employer did not discover a break in service. The employer manufactured one. The reclassification of the grievance record was a deliberate act, performed after the fact, to defeat a vested pension right. The same alteration, in the same hand, appears in the files of 2 other recalled employees. That is not error. That is a practice. Frank felt Ruth's hand tighten in his. The grievance is timely, Marsh read. A concealed fraud does not begin the grievance clock until he could reasonably have discovered it, and he could not, because the concealment was the point. The employer will not be permitted to profit from the very concealment it engineered. She set the page down and read the last part looking up, at the room, at Frank. The grievant's 30 years of continuous service are affirmed. His pension of $317 per month is restored in full, effective his eligibility date. Back payments are ordered from the date of the improper denial, with interest. The award is binding. For a moment the room was silent. Then it wasn't. Behind Frank, 60 men made a sound, not a cheer. These were not cheering men, but a low exhale and rumble, a shifting and a settling, boots on the floor, a couple of rough voices saying that's it and there it is, and Walt Kubiak, 79. Took off glasses he had put on just to hear better and pressed the back of his hand to his eyes. Frank Dolan did not smile. He had promised himself he would not, and he did not. He reached into his coat pocket, and he took out the gold 30-year service pin, the one they'd pressed into his hand at the luncheon while the letter was already in the mail, and he set it on the table in front of him. In the open, under the light, for the second time. The first time he'd set it beside a lie, this time he set it beside the truth. Earned, and now earned twice. Then he turned to Ruth. Her eyes were wet and shining, and she was almost laughing, and almost not, the way she did, and he took both her cold hands in both his warm ones. "It's paid for," Frank said quietly. "All of it. Every month, for as long as you need it. That's all I wanted. Now for the faces." Gerald Prine did not have a calm face anymore. When Marsh read the words in the same hand and named the initials that had been read into the record, his initials, GP, in the corner of 3 men's altered cards, Prine's composure did not crack all at once. It went in stages, the way ice goes. First the folded hands came apart. Then a flush climbed his neck above the collar. Then, when Marsh said the sentence that mattered most to him, he understood, and Frank watched him understand. The presence of the same alteration in additional files Marsh had read, near the end, raises questions of a scope beyond this grievance. Those questions will be matters for others to pursue. Matters for others, not the union. Others, the word landed on Prine like a dropped die. Because Frank's case was over, and Frank had his pension, and that was a wound the company could bandage with money. But the pattern was not Frank's problem now. It was Prine's. 3 altered files in his hand, read into a binding record, in front of witnesses, was no longer a quiet economy performed for the company's benefit. It was his name on a fraud, in the open, waiting for whoever came next, the pension board, the labor department, the company's own lawyers deciding whether Gerald Prine was an asset worth defending or a liability worth throwing to the wolves. The man who had believed nobody read far enough had been read out loud. His face, as the room emptied around him, was the face of a man who has just learned that the quiet was never protection. It was only the time before someone looked. Howard Merrow was not even in the room to hear it. He'd left after his 20 minutes at the first hearing, certain he'd never need to return, and he did not come to the reading. He heard about it the way owners hear about things, through Dolan, in an office, at a remove. But the reckoning reached him anyway, because Helena Marsh's award did not stop at Frank Dolan. It named a practice, and a named practice in a binding arbitration record is not a thing an owner can leave sitting when he's trying to sell a plant. Because that was Merrow's want, the thing under his contempt, he was trimming liabilities to sell. He had inherited the plant and treated the men as ledger lines, and he had been shaving those lines to make the books pretty for a buyer. Prine's quiet economy had been part of the shaving. And now the award had ruled that the shaving was fraud, and that the fraud reached every altered file, and a buyer's lawyers reading that ruling would not see a trimmed liability. They would see an open pit. Every recalled man from that era, with a possible claim, interest running, the Labor Department possibly circling. The exact liability Merrow had tried to make disappear now, tripled and public and impossible to hide in a footnote. The sale stalled. Buyers do not sign over a fraud finding. And so the villain came back to ask. Because the villain always comes back to ask. A week after the award, Dolan called Sal, smooth as ever, and said Mr. Merrow wondered whether Mr. Dolan might be interested in discussing a quiet, global settlement, a lump sum, generous, in exchange for Frank's help in resolving the broader matter without further publicity. In exchange, that was, for Frank going away quietly and taking the pattern with him. Sal put it to Frank plainly, in the union hall, the old contract still on the table. They'll pay you a lot to make it quiet. More than the 4,200, a lot more. And it makes the other men's cases harder. They'd rather buy you off than face all of it. He watched Frank. It's your name. Your call. Frank thought about it for exactly as long as it took to remember Kaczmarek's file, and the third man's, and Kubiak in his cellar keeping faith for 19 years, and 60 men standing with their caps in their hands. Tell Mr. Merrow, Frank said, that the clock runs the same for everybody now. That's all I wanted. Mine's fixed. Theirs isn't. He stood up and put on his coat. Tell him the other men can have their own hearing and their own reading, and if he wants it quiet, he can put every one of them right the way they put me right. That'd be quiet enough. Sal grinned, slow and wide, the first easy grin Frank had seen on him in a year. I'll use those words, he said. I'll enjoy it. A year passed. It was an evening in warm honey light, the kind of light that comes low and golden through a screen door in the last hour before dark, when Frank sat on the front porch with Ruth. The maple in the yard had turned. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere down the block a screen door banged, and a mother called a kid in for supper, the way they always had. the way they always would. Ruth's medicine was paid a year ahead. Frank had done that first thing, walked into the pharmacy and the cardiologist's office with the back payments and paid a year forward, so that no month would ever again be a number penciled small on a calendar. Her breathing still caught sometimes, but it caught in a house that was paid for and covered, and that was a different kind of catching. He'd learned there were kinds. Inside, on the wall in the front room, hung the first pension check, not cashed, a photostat of it, framed. $317. Not framed for the money. Framed for the principle. Framed because a man at a typewriter had once made 30 years into nothing, and a room full of the right people had made it 30 years again. The gold pin lived on Ruth's dresser now. She'd claimed it. She said it had been in his apron pocket too long, and it was time it lived somewhere it could be seen. It sat there in the mornings when she took her insulin, catching the light, earned twice. Once by the 30 years, and once by the year of nights reading 9,000 pages under a bad light. Frank still walked past the plant gate on Sundays. He didn't work there anymore, he was retired now, honestly retired, the way a man ought to be. But he walked past the gate some Sundays and looked through the fence at the presses, standing quiet, and he did not feel bitter. He felt like a man who had made a thing there for 30 years, and had, at the end, made one thing more. Made them tell the truth out loud. Gerald Prine was not at that gate anymore. He'd been reassigned within the month, moved out of personnel, out of the records he'd cleaned, into some small office where he could not touch a file, while the company decided very slowly and very quietly whether to keep him at all. The wolves were still deciding. A man like Prine, it turned out, was only useful while nobody read far enough. Howard Merrow's sale did not go through that year. The corrected liabilities saw to that. Every altered file had to be found, and honored, and paid, Kaczmarek's, and the third man's, and 2 more the Labor Department turned up once it started looking. The pit Merrow had tried to paper over had to be filled with real money before any buyer would come near it. He was still filling it. The ledger lines had turned out to be men, and men, it happened, could reach him after all. Ruth reached over on the porch and took Frank's hand. Her fingers were warmer than they'd been a year ago. He didn't know if that was the medicine or the peace, and he didn't much care which. "Was it worth it?" she asked. She asked it soft, not doubting now, just wanting to hear him say it. Frank looked out at the golden street and the turned maple and the quiet where the whole town's fathers and grandfathers had worked the presses and the diners and the shops of a place like this, and had earned things with their hands that no desk should ever have the power to void. "What's earned on the floor," he said, "can't be voided at a desk. Not while one clause holds, and not while one man's willing to read it." He squeezed her hand. "It was already ours, Ruth. I just went and got it back." They sat a while longer in the honey light, not talking. The pin on the dresser catching the last of the sun through the bedroom window, the check on the wall behind them, the medicine paid ahead, the porch boards warm, and the presses quiet down the block behind a fence a retired machinist would walk past again next Sunday, and the one after that, for as long as he was able. If you've got a quiet man like that in your family, a father, a grandfather, somebody who read the fine print and never raised his voice and never let go, comment the town where he worked. I'd like to know how far this one travels.